include details about specific musky lures, the advantages of some of the newer designs. I say newer because they're being reintroduced. They're ideas that have been around for a while, but they're making more of a popular comeback. And we talk about soft plastic lures, preformed hard plastic lures, different styles of bucktails, details about the bucktails, and then for a surprise bonus at the end of this video, I'm going to be getting into my latest build, which is the most complicated build that I've done so far. I'm only about halfway through the process, but I'm going to show you guys the kind of thought process and engineering that goes behind it. It's one of my military builds, so that'll be a bonus towards the end of the video. But for individuals that want to start getting into making their own fishing lures, whether it's just be a hobby on the side, or if you want to get into actually selling them, there's multiple different ways to go about it. I showed you guys a couple of different examples of wooden lures and also some of the mass production, either hollow plastic or solid plastic preformed lures. Now, most bait builders, they start out with working with wood. Eventually, once they've got that design kind of perfected and they wanted to put it into mass production, they look for facilities that will actually mold that design. And that's specifically what is Bit and Tackle's Warlocks are now. They are solid plastics. In the last video, I said these were wooden. I have some of the initial original versions that are still made out of the basswood. But more recently, over the last, I would say, 10 years or so, they have been preformed. Now, there's not necessarily anything bad about having that done. A wooden lure and a solid plastic lure, as long as the buoyancy is kind of matched, they will swim almost identical within the water because of the weight distribution and design of the lure. It also helps bring the cost down. So having a mass-produced lure, the amount of time that you're putting into it is minimized, and the consistency from lure to lure is exact. A couple of the top two guys that I know that make these solid plastic lures, there's obviously multiple more, but the ones that I see stand out is the Warlocks and also H2O Tackle. Roger at H2O Tackle. I don't have one of his lures down here. They're all actually in my tackle box because I use them all the time. The engineering that he put into the main body of his lures can be changed just by simple placement of hooks. They're solid plastic, so depending on where the hook or the weight distribution is within that one size lure, it can mimic different styles. Now, I recently see somebody else that was just getting into the sport that was in this Lake St. Clair area. And they were getting to the point where they were starting to do more shore fishing and not going out on the boat to, save a little bit of money on fuel and costs. And he threw out some of the lures that he had in his box. I right away recommended some of my more favorite lure manufacturers out there. And one of them that he was talking about was the newer hard head, soft tail type lures. And I recommended him to obviously H2O Tackle because Roger makes the hardtail or the HT. It is basically the same plastic forming as his other lures. Okay, this is not an H2O, but the plastic forming, he basically just hacks it off the back and adds a twister tail to the back. Hence, either hardtail or soft tail abbreviation. If you're still on a budget and you're not necessarily getting into making your own lures, one of the things that you can do is modify old lures. So if you go to thrift stores, garage sales, and you see somebody that's into musky fishing and you see some of the older plastic Joe Booker type crankbaits that might have something mangled on the back end, it is nothing to take off the split ring or separate those pieces and attach your own treble hook and twister tail. Again, this is a Callahan's, I believe. No, this is actually this grub tail is actually from a Toothy's twister tail bucktail that got destroyed. So I just mangled this off of it and attached it to the front half of the crankbait. And now you have that hard head, soft tail type lure with lots of action. It is also repainted and resealed with clear coat. So at that point, then you can also remove the middle hook and add a trailing treble hook, run a little bit less, into the weeds and get a lot less snags. That's the kind of stuff that you can do to modify what normal people would consider junk lures. All right, you don't have to have that $1 million budget or a couple $100,000 budget to get into to musky fishing. You can find stuff used and just modify it with components from any location to make the lure that you want. Right? So talking about soft tails, there's obviously about half dozen soft plastic bait makers that are fairly popular out there. The Medusa, the Swimming Dogs. Okay, this is an earlier edition of the Swimming Dog before they went to the thinner profile. Right, this one actually has the fins on it to help kind of steer it through the water. It has 3 tails. Right, the internal hardware of these is not that expensive. The plastisol that you can get to create these soft plastics is affordable, but the price starts to go up once you start getting into this triple tail type design, because you have to make a mold. Now, whether it be a silicone mold or a harder plastic mold, multi-piece plastic mold, there's not a whole lot of material here, but knowing the process of being able to pour it with different colors and to control the temperature takes a lot more expertise in order to come out with a product in the end final result to be usable. Most of these were internal colors, so like the the orange of the tails, that's actually infused into the polysol along with the black. So this lure was originally black with just an orange tail. Very good for northern pike. As you guys can see, I've added color to it. Okay, just to make it a little bit more flashy, just change it up a little bit more. The paints that are used on plastisol type lures are alcohol based paint. So the alcohol and the polysol will adhere to each other and infuse into the polysol. You're not going to be doing that with water based paints or even oil based paints. So it takes some specific equipment and gear to be able to do that. But in order to just modify plastic, say you go pretty much in my area, if you want soft plastic lures, you can find Musky Innovation type stuff like that in the clearance bin all the time. There are usually colors that people don't like. To change the color or to add flash to the lure, you don't need those special alcohol based paints. You can use any kind of glitter. And basically what you do is just with a heat gun, a hair dryer doesn't necessarily get hot enough unless it's like a mega hair dryer. Even a blowtorch is going to get too hot too fast. Something that you can keep a consistent heat source onto it and control the heat by getting closer or farther apart or farther away from the lure. You want to get to the point where just the surface of the polysol starts to become tacky, and you can sprinkle on glitter, whatever color you want, and then remove the heat source. And as that polysol dries or cools off, those particles of glitter are then locked into the polysol. It's the same thing as if you have a soft plastic that maybe a tail gets ripped or some teeth marks. Just by heating that area and sticking the places of the polysol back together, it will re-adhere right back together. The biggest problem with soft plastics is when you start to indent the hooks into the lure and they get ripped out, they might remove a chunk. But if you get into the soft plastics, you can remelt a little bit of soft plastic, heat up the polysol again with the heat gun, and pour a little bit of that soft plastic, and they will form back together. They'll melt together or weld together. You can add your own eyes the exact same way. You can heat up that area, press in some three-dimensional eyes, and let the polysol cure around it. And you can also re-dip a clear liquid polysol over the top of older polysols, and it'll cover that eyeball area so it locks everything in. So there's multiple advantages to the soft plastics. Very common to be using these. The only thing that I don't personally like about soft plastics is once you get to the larger versions, they tend to run a little bit heavier. The pounders, obviously, 1 pound of polysol and with the rigging inside, and it's a lot of up and down action. That's one of the designs too with the fins. You notice on the Medusas they have a much wider body to them, almost like the bottom of a jet. Okay, like an airplane jet. They're much wider like this. That's to help suspend that when you release the slack into the line after pulling it up, it will help it glide. Where a swim dog that has a narrow body to it will sink a lot faster. It'll be a lot more erratic. So the Medusas will come up, and because of the water foil that the design is incorporating, it suspends and it'll have a much longer drop before it starts to really dive. This variation tried that exact same thing with some kind of fins on it, but these fins are flexible. They're not as stiff as the Medusas, so it's the hang time is very minimal. All right. Now, kind of going back, one step back, talking about the hard infused or pressure infused hard plastics. These are a couple of other different variations of lures that were originally made in wood and then they were transformed into mass production. Okay, this one, the design of this lure, let me get both hands on this. The design of this lure is another individual from Wisconsin here. Now this is a repaint, so don't go by the color. You can't find this is a custom color that I did, but this design of this lure comes in multiple different variations from 5 to 8 inch, and it's a multi-function lure. You can use this as a crankbait, just with a steady retrieve. You can use this as a rise and dive because of that arch. The lure will go down, but because of the buoyancy of the the plastic body, it will then come back up, and because of the shape, it will sometimes go in reverse as it rises up. You can use it as a twitch bait, so just like instead of a glide bait but a jerk bait, you can twitch it, and it has action built into it. Okay, so multi-function and just that simple shape and design. There is no lead weight added into this. Okay, it's just one solid molded piece. Let's get a closer look at that. So if you're really on a budget and you need a lure that will fit into multiple different locations on the body of water that you're fishing, this lure will pretty much do it all. Now here's another one that is a rise and dive / jerk bait. It has the tail of a rise and dive. It has the front weight, removable weight as in a rise and dive. Now remember, this is a solid plastic. It was originally a wooden version that was remolded in plastic. So all the different variations of hardware, okay, it's just a lead head over a screw head that goes into a threaded slug. Now multiple variations out on the market have that kind of design or something similar. When you buy a certain style of lure or a certain brand of lure, they'll normally have the weight systems sold separately so you can run heavier or lighter configurations. This lure itself, the way it's shaped and designed like a gator, okay, it impresses the person that goes up and buys it. I mean, it looks different. It's going to be something that stands outside of the norm. But there's one thing about this lure that is unique to just this lure, and that's the line tie portion. You know that. Notice that it is a bar that goes across, so that when your line is tied onto here, or with a leader clasp, each jerk, the line slides across that bar instead of being fixed in one position with like a screw-in eye screw or eye hook. Just a little bit different variation, and it adds a little bit of different side-to-side action. With this lure, though, the design of the head, that portion is impressive, but the design, the rest of the lure, and the tail, it does not mimic any other kind of rise and dive that's out there, because it is a flat back, fairly similar to like a Suic, but the belly is rounded off. So it throws in a little bit of different action into it, but it's very inconsistent. So if you're trying to get used to your lure to be able to manipulate it the way you want to, this is unpredictable. Other than the level that its buoyancy is, or the float level within the water, that's the only thing. Because of the way the line tie is on here, each individual action from your fishing pole through the line, this lure does something different every time. So just take that in mind if you guys are building something. There's this line across design is something to take into consideration. All right, this one is also something that started out as a wooden lure. Somebody carved in their garage or in their basement, whatever, and then they put it into mass production into plastic molding. Right, now, in order to build something like this, or create something like this, either carving it or whittling it, or if you have the machinery to be able to machine it out of wood, the amount of time that you are going to have into making just something of this shape, you're going to have a couple of hours. Simple as that. Now, by pre-molding this in plastic, having that consistency from lure to lure to lure, you might have to pay $2 to $3 to have one specific lure molded. Okay, other than the initial cost of a contract with a plastic molding company, usually they have a minimal amount of, like, say, 1,000 pieces before they'll set up an agreement with you. But each one of those pieces out of that 1,000, the overall cost and what you have into the actual lure is going to be less than $5. And then you have to go through the painting and adding the metal components. Okay, but this lure, to get this lure down to the $20 that I paid for it, it's in there. But if you were to make this out of wood and build it as a custom, it would have to cost more than that, because the individual making this and the machines required to create this is going to cost more than that. So that's kind of the difference between the transition between a fully custom lure to a box store lure. So hollow bodied plastic, Chinese formed or Japanese formed plastic compared to solid plastics is kind of the transition between a full custom wooden lure and a box store lure. Like I had mentioned before, some of the plastics that I use, I'm trying to look for one that I've got here that's one of my larger lures like this. This is plastic. It is preformed plastic. It is actually a product by Smooth On Products That's a self-infused plastic, so it's got its own buoyancy built into the plastic. It's not necessarily solid. Um, your initial cost of creating the mold is close to about $100, but then the material used to make something like this is approximately $10 worth of plastic. Now this is a large lure, so the smaller the lure, obviously the cost goes down. So you can get your fixed cost down to that, $7 or so of material, and then you have to add in your hooks and your line ties and your hardware. That will bring you into that $10 to $12 range to create something like this, not including your time. So if you're painting them, you have to also consider that. The more generic the paint job, obviously the faster that it can be done. So you're not putting a lot of time into it. So that's the kind of difference between, say, your $20 lure and your $100 lure, is the amount of process that's gone into making it, the man hours and time that's put into it. So that's the driving cost. So when you see a price on a lure, you also have to think and be respectful of thinking, how much time did the person actually take and put into that one individual lure as a custom lure? Or if you get into the mass production lures, okay, they probably got, for this lure itself, just the material and the hardware in there, it's probably less than $5 total that they have into the actual lure. And then the paint, which is fairly cheap after, mass producing. The hardware is less than $10, obviously. To pay $20 for this, they're going to be making probably a little bit of profit. Custom guys, profit. Yeah, some of them out there, they're charging $100 for a lure. Obviously, there's not that much money invested into those lures. All right. But you have to think, if they're in a legitimate business, I'm going to take this for example, because this is going to be a heads up for you guys that are looking at getting into selling lures to actually make money. All right, realize that is very difficult, very time consuming, and it takes a very large investment to get the mass production of lures out there before you can start getting profits back. And it takes some time. So if your design does not work or a failure, you're sitting on all kinds of stock. If it's very popular, realize that there's usually a spike in popularity, and then it just, somebody either copies it or finds a way to do it cheaper. They come out with another variation, and then again, you're sitting on stock that's unsold. So there's, just like any kind of investment, there's possibilities of losing out on it. You guys have to excuse me. I don't know what's up with this device. It goes through cycles of changing color. If you guys notice that in the videos, I don't know why it does that. When I'm outside, if it's consistent sunlight, it doesn't do it. It's just under this mode. We'll be fixing that in the future. But for these little informational videos, not a big deal. All right, now I'm going to start getting into bucktails next. Bucktails, and I'll get into the bonus part of the video. Bucktails have many different variations. A way they're constructed, the way they swim through the water, the hardware that's put onto them. Again, this newer channel that I just recently found that is fishing the Lake St. Clair area. This individual just got into the hobby, and he took about $1,000 and got invested and just bought everything that he could get his hands on, and he's starting from scratch. Now, bucktails is one of them that he had, and he didn't really know the variations that were out there. There's thousands of variations of bucktails. It all comes down to how they're constructed, how they swim within the water, the material that is being used. It's endless. So I can't necessarily give you a price of how much it costs to build a bucktail. I can give you prices on what the blades cost, or what the leaders, or even the beads, the hardware But the combination of the whole entire package of a bucktail, it can be anywhere from a simple $5 all the way up to about $50, depending on how complex a bucktail gets. You'll see with the next variation, you can see where the prices will really start to jump up. Now, talking about bucktails, the number one lure probably accounted for the most amount of large toothy critters caught across North America is going to be a bucktail. And your Mepps Musky Hunter bucktails probably own the record of catching the most amount of fish, period. Even the larger Musky Hunter bucktail is probably accounted for countless bass and other species of fish other than, just other than muskies and northern pike. So if you ever get a chance to get your hands on one of those outside of the package, pull the skirting back and you'll see how those are constructed with different weight systems, how they're tied off, how they might have segments within the bucktail. And of course, obviously the material that's made onto them is either synthetic or an actual organic bucktail material. Each angler is going to say that they like a certain style. There is nothing predictable about muskies. Simple as that. But one of the things that I practice is trying to throw out something that's different, either by vibration, the visual effects, the action of the lure is different than what the masses are being used. So instead of that mass-produced Mepps Musky Hunter, or Musky Killer bucktail, as I call them, because a lot of their setups, the treble hooks compared to the spinners themselves, is a very long addition. So from the line tie to the back of the hook is very long. So when a fish comes up to get it, the mass is very much in the center, but this hook hangs off way to the back. And a lot of times on a rear set hook, those are the ones that get back down into the back of the throat of the fish. So that's why I call them the Musky Killers. The one fish that I've ever lost was actually on a Mepps Musky Hunter. Those hooks are just way too far back, and they're too small. Okay, so by going to a specific musky type bucktail, one of the things I like to include is a much larger rear treble hook. And if you can add any kind of twister tail or anything behind the treble hook, that moves that portion of when they actually feel something in their mouth and they clamp down, they're feeling it sooner, so this hook is actually making contact more towards the front of their jaws instead of being back to the gills. So even if you do have an older style rear small treble hook, just by adding some kind of a twister tail into the back of it, it's going to reduce the amount of inhalants of the bucktail to actually do damage. Okay, we want to preserve the quality of our fishing, and we want the fish to get bigger, obviously. So fish that last, can live longer and are less damaged, better for the next generation or for the next catch to get them. That also goes with the rear treble hook on the bucktails also being put on a pivot that are not actually shrink wrapped into position. Okay, that's going to cause a little bit different swim action within the water. But to offset that, again, you look at the construction of the lure. Where this one, instead of being tied off like a normal bucktail, that's actually a lead bullet weight. So it is reintroducing the weight more towards the back of the lure to get it down, instead of the treble hook being the weight that causes this to tilt down in the water. Make sense? Another thing that you want to look at too is that a lot of the newer, within the last 2 years, a lot of guys have been adding the rear blade system also. Okay, it's becoming fairly common. Your TNA dragons, chatterbaits are also adding a additional blade to the back of their lures for additional action to mimic the tail of a fish. So a bucktail or any fishing lure for that matter is there to mimic an actual fish. So I'm going to try to hold this in place and show you guys the side profile of this bucktail without stabbing myself here. Okay, now you can imagine that as that's going through the water, this blade mimics the gill area or the head of a bluegill. These represent the fins or the dorsal fins up on top as it's fluttering through the water, and then the smaller spinnerbait at the back is the actual action of the tail of the fish. Makes sense, right? By giving it a larger blade on the front and a thicker body here, you're giving that larger profile and you're adding a little bit smaller action at the back to mimic real fish. So when a muskie or northern pike sees this going through the water, the thing that they can see the easiest, now I know Larry Ramsell and other individuals are going to argue that biologists have identified exactly how a muskie sees with its eyes. Okay, I'm not going to argue that. I'm not a biologist. But what my experience tells me is that fish normally will go for the easier target or the larger portion of the profile. Makes sense, right? So those bucktails that are designed with all the profile up at the front, they usually get engulfed. But those longer skirted bucktails that spread that profile all over a longer distance, muskies will normally won't get just attached or won't just get hooked by the rear portion hook. They'll usually get hooked by the center hook if you have one installed. All right. So adding these little things onto the back, make it mimic a real fish, and add a little bit more action to it, and it differentiates that bucktail from any of the other ones that might be being used on the lake. You can add that kind of device to pretty much any kind of lure. Okay, whether it be a flap tail, surface lure, bucktail, chatterbait, anything like that, you can add them in there. Now let's, for just a short time between this one and the next lure, I'm going to talk about blade sizes and configuration. The larger the blade, obviously the more thump that it creates within the water. It disperses more water and it has more surface area to create that. It will also create a much larger front profile, because now if you can imagine this when it's going through the water and this is spinning around, it creates a larger profile. Once again, you guys hear me beat it into your head about profile with any kind of lure. The larger the profile, the more effects has over a larger portion or a larger area of that body of water, depending on the clarity of the water. It also gives a larger target for a larger muskie to hit. Okay, if you have a profile that's really thick up here, the fish is not going to grab down here. Okay, so trying to get that profile as short as you possibly can and as thick as you possibly can to get the action is going to give you the greatest amount of success and hook sets. Now, with the bigger blades, obviously dispersing, one single blade with this blade whacking around through the water, it creates a much heavier throw off and vibration into the shaft and through the material. You'll also notice that not only the vibration is being emanated from the hardware, it's also being transitioned into the material of the bucktail. The lighter this material is in the water, the more it's going to flutter from the vibration of that blade going around. If you have two blades that are exactly the same size that balance out, or if you have a clevis, an S clevis, that the blades are locked together, the amount of vibration put into that shaft and into the material is reduced. Scott, I'm trying to think of the name, with the trilogy Bucktails, you notice that he had his original versions was a 3-bladed solid piece blade with a hole specifically just drilled into the middle of them. They were very front heavy. That blade was very heavy, so they'd run a lot deeper. Okay, so if you were in the shallows, say 5 foot or less, they were right down to the bottom. Okay, so they're more meant for that 10 to 20 foot, flat bottom type fishing where you're trying to get down to the weeds early spring or very late fall. But you also have to retrieve them at a fair amount of speed to keep them up in the water column. So they're very fast bucktail. So a good spring choice. You have noticed on his latest editions that he has, instead of that hole drilled through the center of that big blade, he has put a slot into it. So when this blade is going around, it is transitioning more vibration into the shaft, causing the body of the lure to get more action and more vibration. Right? So the front profile is fairly large with that solid blade, and because of the slot into it now, it's getting the vibration. He's brought it back in. So even guys that are building lures, they learn as they go of how they can modify and increase the successful rate of that lure by changing different things. So this will be one of my variations with a single heavy blade. This is the number 10 actually. And coloring the blades also, in my opinion, makes a difference. If you're just using the solid brass, solid silver, orange, whatever, they still work. But again, how many bucktails out there match that exact same build? So by adding your own coloring, foils, whatever, to the blade, as this is spinning around, it is giving that effect onto the lure, and I also mimic onto the tail section. Easy enough? Okay, so now talking about that front blade, we're going to go on to the next variation. And now most bucktails you can get for less than 30 bucks. Box store bucktails you can get less than $30 or even less than 20 in most cases. When you start getting into custom bucktails, the builders are taking into consideration those vibrations and the profile and the way that they swim. Like I said, with the trilogies, they're very front heavy, so they like to run deeper. The one that I showed you guys earlier, this one here, is a twin blade using the longer blades. The beads are a little bit heavier, but the weight is at the back. So when this is in the water, without having to bend the leader to get the thump, this naturally swims tail heavy, creating that same effect, and you're going to get more thump out of these blades. Now they're not connected. And it's not an a fixed spinner. Okay, those blades are separate. So they're going to be unbalanced, and they will create the vibration, again, back to that lighter foil. I like using a combination of foils and feathers. I'm going to show you guys one that's pretty much all feather here. Okay, when I go to using the Marlboro or the feathers, I like to try to throw in some plastic. I always get a variation of materials to match vibration. Remembering that the soft plastics, if there is a vibration in the leader, and the soft plastic and the rear treble hook is affixed with shrink wrap or shrink tubing, any of the vibration that's coming through the shaft, this portion of the lure, the soft plastic, absorbs the vibration from that. So you're defeating the purpose of having a vibration built into the bucktail. So anytime you use soft plastic as a trailer to a bucktail, it needs to have a split ring joint, right? Because that's going to add to the vibration and noise. Those metal pieces are going to clack together, and the rubber is not going to, or the polysol is not going to deaden the sound and vibration. So when you are adding in, like I said earlier, if you want to add a little bit of flash or reduce the amount of swallows of that treble hook, add in the soft plastics. If the rear treble hook is affixed as part of the leader, break it off or cut it off and add that split ring. Separate it. You'll still have the weight at the back to run tail down to get that more thump out of the front blade and give you a larger profile, but you're not going to be killing the vibration and the effects of the design. Last bucktail before we get into the bonus. Now, this lure has been reintroduced and made more popular from Lee Tauschen of Lee Lures. He calls it, I'm trying to think, there's been so many companies that have actually made this lure. It is a bucktail that has a wooden body built into it. I don't get mad because I don't think, forgetting the name here. But Lee's variation, he just changed the spelling of the word. And the Boilermaker, I'm sorry, this is considered the Boilermaker style bucktail. Now, the original Boilermaker was actually made, mass-produced made by a company out of Illinois. That was approximately 20 years ago. They have gotten more into the mass producing of parts, so they don't necessarily make lures anymore. You can still order them, but they're old stock. Lee has come out and made the Boilermaker, which is a rear wooden body attached to a frontal bucktail. So the difference in the swimming action of these is because of the buoyancy of the wood, the lure actually wants to lift up the tail end. So as it's going through the water, the faster you retrieve, the lure actually wants to tilt. And because of the placement of the weights in the front, it actually wants to run nose down. Now the advantages of that is if you have weeds that are now getting closer to the surface, these blades, as they're spinning, actually plow and separate those weeds so that the main body of the lure can pass through that section or that area. So it's kind of making a bucktail a weedless bucktail. The other reason for running these is because they do float because of the rear wooden section. If you start getting into really thick weeds and you start to get tangled, if you let it sit or slow down, this will actually rise to the surface and float like a bob around the surface. So again, you can kind of control the level that it runs within the water. If you want something that runs 3-4 feet down, the faster retrieve will allow it to run that deeper. If you want something that's skimming the surface of the water or just below the surface of the water where you're starting to get the wake from the blades, this lure you can slow it down and these blades will start to break the surface of the water, creating a little bit of surface water type surface lure. Again, how they're constructed is with different kind of blades at the front, just like you would a normal bucktail material, but then there's also a joint in between the front of the wood lure and the bucktail. So if you do have an older glide bait, you can attach a glide bait or something that has a buoyancy of a surface lure. Let me see if I got an example here. Like this bomber here, this jerkbait will float. You could also attach this to the back of an older bucktail, and now you have that Boilermaker style lure. Okay, pretty simple. Or if you have a glide bait, like I showed you in a previous video, this is the trolling glide bait that I have. You can also have that leader on the front, so you just replace this with a bucktail, and this would be at the back. And now you have a Boilermaker. Okay. Now the other variations of the Boilermaker that are coming out there now One of the other things that adds, now with having a wooden body attached to the back of the lure, the wooden body actually absorbs the smaller tune of that vibration of those blades going around. Just the same with like soft plastics being attached, like I said previously. The wooden body will absorb some of those vibrations, the higher pitched ones. The lower thump of the larger blades, they will still exist and they'll still create water pressure or pressure in front of the blades. Okay, the concussion that's happening within the water in front of the blades. The vibration going through the lure, again, if it's all one piece, that wood or plastic, whatever be back here, is absorbing some of that vibration. So again, that's why you want to have the 2-section flexible joint type bucktail. To increase the vibration, now this goes for bucktails across the industry right now. Without using the S clevis, so that these blades are perfectly balanced, you want to use single clevises that are separated, so the blades can spin at different rates. Also using different size blades. So if you're using, if you're used to using number 8 Colorado blades, changing up the material of those number 8 blades so that one blade is heavier than the other creates more vibration. It's offsetting the balance. Changing the style blades, whether you're going from a Colorado to a willow blade or a French blade, again, creates more vibration that is transferred into the main leader shaft of the lure. Anything you can do to break up the vibration that's happening in the lure, but yet retaining a larger profile, is the key ticket today. That's why the success of the Boilermaker has really come on, because now guys can do all of those different effects and control the depth of where they're running, depending on what body of water they're on. By just changing that split ring, you now can create a bunch of small bucktails that are more front heavy with all kinds of different blade configurations, and you can attach and just create some simple cylinder shaped pieces like this, mass produced. Say if you got a wood lathe, you can kick these out pretty fast and paint them from whatever different coloration that you want and come up with multiple different combinations of color. And because of that joint in the middle of that, you can have a lure that actually skims the surface, runs front heavy down to plow through the thicker weeds. It still has a vibration because you have the different size blades onto it. It's going to give it a different thump, different vibration throughout the lure. And because the rear section is split ringed onto the front, the wood is not necessarily disturbing the vibration that's coming off of that shaft. Easy enough. Or to the point where you can actually add rattles, which I have on this one. If you guys notice the eyes, this was actually drilled through and there's a rattle chamber in between those two eyes. So even as this is going through the water, a lot of times it'll dogtail through the water. There's vibration built in to the wooden body of the Boilermaker. So you get the vibration from the blades through the materials and also the rattle inside of the rear body. This is probably one of my favorite bucktails to throw from mid-July through basically through the turnover. So once the water starts getting back below 70 degrees and there's lots of weeds, this is the lure that I like to throw. And because of the larger rear body section, it gets a very large profile and you can slow down the retrieve in those warmer temperatures. It plows through the weeds, it stays up closer to the surface with the wooden portion of the body floating up like this, the tail up. It also keeps the hooks up and out of the weeds, but also creates a strike zone that whenever a muskie comes up, wherever they decide to grab this lure, there is a hook right into the strike zone. Simple as that. So again, the larger body, the larger profile gives them a centralized location to strike, and right in that zone is where the hooks are. Keeps the hooks up out of the weeds and also into the strike zone of the fish. It allows you to slow down the retrieve. And the larger profile is being able to be picked up and seen from a greater distance. So you're not having to throw this 15 times over one small area. You can cover a lot of ground, put your trolling motor up to a little bit faster, cover a little bit larger area, and toss this maybe 3 times over a 200 square foot area. One to the left, one down the center, one down to the right. And if there's any fish in that vicinity, they're going to be able to see this, they're going to be able to feel this, and they're going to be able to see it. Okay, so it's just awesome lure, but again, it runs closer to the surface. The slower you go, the more onto the surface it runs. This is not going to be getting down to those fish are holding down to the bottom at say you're 10 feet. Thinner weeds, reeds, flat bottom, sand bottom type situations. That's going to be more this style. Okay, the big blade, front heavy, or the trilogy style. I know Scott, so that's why I mentioned the trilogies, but there obviously are different variations out there that use these solid blades on the front. And even those individuals are coming out with variations now with twin sets of solid blades onto it, so they make contact, create even more noise. They're going to that rear prop. I showed you this one right here. So this design here, where there's actually 2 sets of blades, they're actually putting this on the front of the bucktails. There's been companies that make these blades out of aluminum, one piece all the way across. So they spin very easy, just like this here. Okay, that's what, when you go to the Musky Expos, that's what they're doing. They're sitting at their booth and they're spinning it around. Of like, see how impressed that is? It spins forever, right? Very little resistance. As soon as it hits the water and you start to retrieve, the blades start going. But there's 0 vibration going into the shaft and creating a vibration. That is a big key that we're finding out within amongst musky anglers, is the vibration and the sound has a much drastic improvement of increased catching of fish over other things. That's one of the things with the soft plastic lures. The guys are finding out soft plastic lures that are going much larger because they have to have that large profile to be able to get seen from distances. You start adding sound to these and you're going to increase the rate that these get eaten. The bucktails that are running these kind of blades, they're almost identical to these kind of blades right here running on the front. They're so balanced, yeah, they spin forever, but there's got to be something there to create noise and vibration. So again, they're creating over, like Scott has figured out with the trilogy, is by putting that slot into the blade, is creating a vibration into it. And that vibration is transferred over into the material. So the foils shake a lot more with vibration, whereas in the bucktail, they don't shake whatsoever. It is only the water that's moving past them that cause the hairs to actually move. Vibration doesn't. Okay, that's the difference between using organic type hairs to the flash bow. Okay, the marble or marabou, again, the vibration from the blade doesn't transfer over into the feathers. It is the water that's transferring over the top of them. So any of the water that's going by the blade causing turbulence is what's causing the marabou to change or to flutter. That's different variations. Alright, I'm going to see if I can get this done in an hour. This is going to be the bonus portion of this video. This is getting into my personal stuff. What kind of got me on the map was my military builds. Whether it be aircraft, naval craft, tanks, half tracks, Any of those kind of vehicles I've made into fishing lures, usable fishing lures. Whether or not they're actually used to be caught for fish, but most guys, veterans, any kind of fundraisers, they love them because guys really want to get them. And I only make one of each, so they carry a lot of value for a collector. The one I'm about to show you is my most intense, most time-consuming build I've ever done. Now, I just most recently got back into the musky lure building. For the last 2 years, I took a kind of a hiatus because I couldn't make any money with COVID going on because the locations I was selling my lures, nobody was visiting. Simple as that. So now that I'm getting back into it, it's still kind of bad timing because now that we're, without getting into politics too much, we're literally, on the cusp of World War III. So military builds is going to be something that, is kind of a controversial subject, but it's something that I still like to build. Now, I showed you guys the Dark Star jet that I did for the release of Top Gun, or Maverick. Okay, for you guys that my son was born before the Top Gun thing, but my son's name is Maverick, so one of the things that he thinks is cool is anything that comes up with his name. So the movie came out, and I created the Dark Star. So this is actually his lure for future times. But now, bonus material. Da-da-da. This is what I've gotten so far for the main body. Now, there's not anything very complicated with this design so far. All right, it is made out of wood. You can see the trap door. I have to drill and hog this out to get the weight of this lure underneath 7 ounces. Okay, that's not the specific hard portion of this lure. This is not what has taken me, weeks and months to figure out. If you take off the wing portion of it, it's not much different than a large diameter rise and dive. But this is the Osprey aircraft. For any of you guys that know what an Osprey is, it's a vertical takeoff, turbopropped airplane. And it is a plane that I worked on initially when I got into the military in service. These were just being introduced into the military, and they need mechanics to go through the schooling to be able to, work on stuff like that. And that's what I got my initial introduction in. Shortly after the introduction of these planes, the first 7 that were brought into the fleet, 2 of them crashed. So they put a pause on the training, which forced me to have to go into other services, and I ended up going special forces. But anyway, they have come back, been modified, reintroduced, and they're very popular amongst Marines, especially. You can carry a lot of weight, they're fast, but they're very complex and complicated. Now, same with the fishing lure. Now, in order to get the rotating engines on this, I had to come up with a couple different ideas of how that is actually going to work within the water. It's not the air or the hydraulics controlling the tilt of the engines. Okay, so what I came up with is that inside the wings, you can see I have square stock. That's not a tube, it's actually square stock. And in order to attach the engines, I then took round tubing, and that is inserted into that square stock, almost like the torsion bar suspension on trailers and trucks. Okay, I'm going to push that out a little bit so you guys can see it. There's a square stock. In order to get the pivot so that both engines pivot at the exact same rate, I need to attach them through. And it can't be enough that they'll just sit there and spin and spin and spin around in this direction. Okay, they have to be able to lay forward when it's in motion forward. When it comes to a standstill, the engines have to be able to tilt and prop up. So with that square stock and then using round stock that fits directly inside of that, I have now created an axis for that to happen that's fixed from one side to the other. This one is bent up right now. I've got the other one glued into the other engine. So I'm showing you one engine that hasn't been glued in yet. So this round stock is not the exact piece, but you guys can get the idea now. So this round stock will actually spin inside of that square stock. And it connects both engines together. Right? Now, here is the engine portion. Okay, so that'd be the back. This is the front. You can notice the big air intake section here. That would be like the turbo intake. That is what catches the water. So when this is moving forward, let's see if I can on the outside here. So when this is in the forward movement, there's something there to cup the water and make the engines lay down horizontal. When it comes to stop, the engines have to be able to tilt up like it's landing vertically in the water. Okay, so now the buoyancy of this lure has to be able to, when it comes to a stop, that there is a slow sink to this lure, mimicking a rise and dive. Okay, so it's going to be up and down motion, but as this is sinking, I want the blades to spin. And if you guys have noticed some of the talk about the trilogies, they have a new spinner bait where they actually put that bucktail blade, on that spinner blade with a split ring. So when that lure comes to a stop and it starts to sink, the blade actually goes up and has a spin on the descent. I actually contacted Scott to see if I could use one of his trilogy blades. Some of his older ones that had the pinholes in them. He was out. He doesn't have that style anymore. He's got all the ones with the slots. But I needed something that has the balance and is lightweight. I don't need the weight of that blade holding the engine forward or forcing it down. I need something lighter. So I had to come up with something myself. So in order to do that, I cupped the engine to create air pockets or a water pocket. So in forward motion, the water is connecting here, forcing the engine down. I have to add a pin into the wing with a slot on the back side of the engines to restrict the movement from vertical to only this far and horizontal. Okay, it limits the movement to just those two locations. So on the descent, the engine will only go to this portion and slowly descend like a rise and dive sinking rate. Or in a forward motion, these engines then tip forward. And because of the blade diameter, and this being wood, floating wood, buoyancy, I can control the sink rate and the rise rate and where it's running in the water column. I can get those blades to actually run on the top like a whopper plopper style blade. Where is it? Where'd it go? This is the one, but it'll have the same action as this going across. So if you can imagine this, the forward motion going this way, the blades are in the front and they're spinning. When it comes to a stop, it starts to sink. Those blades then spin in the opposite direction like it's landing. All right. So that's why it's very complicated. I sound like I'm rambling here, but it's very complicated. There's so many things and balance points that have to go into this build. That's what's taking me forever because I have to get the engines balanced perfect once they're all assembled to where this lure can sink, and then when it's running at the surface, it has a little bit of tail action here to keep the tail end down in the water to where these blades still crack the surface of water, getting that vibration and sound while mimicking the actual air or a Marine Corps Osprey airplane. So it's vertical takeoff and forward motion. Now on top of that, this is just the wooden portion of the engines. You can see that the engines are mounted out away from the main fuselage, just enough that I need to put a large blade on here. So to reduce the size of the actual fishing lure, so it's actually, reasonable, something that you could actually fish with. Okay, all my lures you could actually throw out and fish with if you wanted, but to also be mimicking an aircraft. So I had to take that circumference and figure out how wide it could actually go with the blades to maximize that and give it the largest and most flash going through the water, okay, and still yet clear this fuselage. So these, I have yet to cut them out, So they said it's in process. Well, that's the size of the blade right there. More the center. You can see it's just cracking right there. Right, so I got to cut two of these out simultaneously, identical, so they got to be the same balance. And I have to figure out how to attach them to the engines. All right, and I think I figured it out. Now, a standard rivet. Normally, you'd put it in a hole, put your rivet gun on there, and it spreads that aluminum out. I need that to be able to spin on that shaft. So on the front of the engine, create a nail hole, and I can insert that rivet to where the mushroom style or mushroom portion of that will actually spin on that shaft. Right? So that gives me something for the blade to spin on. But that'd be kind of ugly looking at the front of that. And if you look at the real life size Osprey, it has a cone on the front of it. So now I'm going to put this together kind of the way it's going to go. Now in order to get that blade to be fixed to that rivet shaft, it needs to be glued into place. So I could put a tab of glue on there, but it doesn't look that great. So I went and made the cones. Okay, well the cones have a hole drilled into them. So now once this is glued on, it's actually sandwiching the blade between the rivet head and this cone, but still allows it to rotate on the blade. And there you go. Okay, that's loosely put together, but you guys get the idea. So as that blade is spinning, the water is pushing it back towards the engines. It is the rivet head that is allowing the space in there to allow that blade to spin freely. As this goes around, it's also cutting through the water. Okay. Now all this has to be put together, float tested over and over and over again, modified, shaved, carved, in order to get that balance, and then both engines have to be identical. Right? So that when they're going through the water, each blade is spinning, not causing it to turn, and when it comes to a stop, that they both pivot to the point where that in the downward motion, the sinking motion, the blades spin the opposite direction. And then again on the line tie, when you pull on the line tie, you notice it's way down here. When you pull on the line tie again, it causes the airplane to go nose up. And these blades have enough flat surface on the bottom that when water transfers over this, it actually tilts those blades back down into the direction of flow, and the blade starts spinning again. So as you guys can see, very complicated build. In order for me to turn around and say, oh, I'm going to make this and I'm going to sell this for $100, okay? The materials built into this is less than $20. The engineering behind this cost a lot of money. There's very few guys that can figure this out and create something original like this. Very few. So that's where the money comes in. I'm going to be building this one. It will be going out for auction. It is not going to be something that is going to be cheap, less expensive of your top world-renowned musky lures. Okay, so your Roman maids are $400 to $700 now. There's a hell of a lot more engineering into this, and a lot more time put into this than those even close. So this is going to be something that is going to be a highly collectible lure. Like I said, I don't normally do these all the time. I do have a calling for military builds, period. But for whatever reason, my local bait shop around here, they want more military builds. They have a lot more customer call for them. But in all honesty, guys, I can't take lures and throw them out. Like this one's fairly simple. I could make something like this and sell it for $30 and break even. Not this one. There's no way. I could not get into this complicated of lures and sell them for anything less than $200. Period. Even if I were to duplicate this over and over and over again out of plastic, I still, the cost of it and everything, get everything balanced out would still take me a lot of time. So there's no way I could sell these to the affordable fisherman that's looking at them. So custom lures run more money because of the engineering and the thought process going into them. And any of them that have the moving parts like that, you're looking at a lot more money. Okay, there's not everybody could make one of these and get them to actually work. Once this is actually tested and everything's balanced out, the slightest difference, even a layer of clear coat, is going to change the action of the lure, the flow of the lure, and how these engines actually rotate. So it's got to be done multiple different times. Mistakes have to be made. As you guys can see on the wings, even you can see a stitched piece of wood here. The original wing that I had onto it, I shaved one side too thin compared to the other, and the only other piece of wood that I had a factory stitch joint onto it. Okay, so that's the only thing I had to use. So I had to start back over from scratch. The green stuff that you guys see there is lightweight Evercoat body filler. So any kind of the joints in the wood that I might have sand a little bit bigger, or if I'm leaving a little slack into them for adjustment, I glue them into place, and then to seal all that back up again, I do use Bondo, the Evercoat body filler, lightweight body filler. It's easy to sand. It sands at the same rate as poplar. This is poplar again. The wing is pine. But I have to drill this out yet to get the buoyancy of just the main fuselage, and then start adding on the components, all right, and getting it all balanced out. Paint it, clear it again, and then redo some more sink tests. So I'm going to keep this bait open because that's going to be my weight control. Once the engines are on it, if I need more front weight, I need to drill out the back. If I need more weight at the back, I need to add lead weight after it's painted already. And then I have to be able to close this up. So the back door of this engine is going to be just like the real Osprey that actually opens and closes. But I'm going to actually print out a sticker that looks like the individuals standing in the back of an Osprey, put that on there, and then have a flap that can close or open. So if this lure starts to sink back and down, that flap will actually open and reduce the amount of backward motion that it has, just like the rear flaps of like a NASCAR stock car. Flaps open once backwards, slows it down, allows the car to keep forward. Same thing with this. All right, two hook designs in the same location as the landing gear of an actual Osprey. So I'm making a fishing lure mimicking something in real life. It's very complicated. This will be my pride and joy, I guess, of it out of all my builds. And the lucky person that gets that, it's going to be something that for years and years and years down the road will bring a lot of conversation, and it'll stretch the imagination for bait builders to see what they can duplicate and how complex they can get things to get them to work. So with that, I'm gonna let you guys go. Hopefully it was some informational for you, good information for you guys that are just getting into sport, or if you're just starting to build your own lures, whether it be bucktails, soft plastics, hard plastics, or modifying junk to get it to work the way you want. There's room for everybody within the sport, no matter what your budget level is. Once you start building your own lures, it's very easy to get carried away. Don't try to just mimic one style of lure. By getting diverse and making multiple different variations, tweaks and tunes your ability to know what needs to be done to get a lure to act a certain way. And the more variety of lures that you can make, the better the lure maker you will be. Okay? If you want to get into it as far as making money, sure, go ahead and create one simple design, get it mass produced, and then try to keep up with the amount of money coming in from them to pay for your initial overhead. All right, take that from a word of advice. So with that, catch you guys later.